So now you can see that the dough has just about completed bulk proofing, okay? So if you look back in some of the previous videos, it's a good comparison of where the dough was. It was fairly low. And I know that with this bowl and with my dough, like this is a really good time where the bulk proofing, the bulk fermenting is done. Okay, you can see over here the bubbles. Can you get one and look at this? Is that showing up in the video?
Oh yeah.
Is it?
Mm-hmm.
Like you can see here, you can see how the sourdough has eaten, and it's created a lot of bubbles and a lot of gas, causing it to raise. This is a little bit of a personal feel. I know this bowl, I know the dough, and I know the sourdough. So I know that this is a good point where I'm ready to be done with bulk proofing. And I'm ready to move next to the next stage, which is final proofing. So final proofing is where I divide the dough into two loaves. Like I mentioned before, all of this makes 2 loaves. So I put each loaf in its own banneton, its own wooden basket. Okay, so this is going to be the transition from bulk fermenting to final proofing. So with final proofing, you let each loaf proof in its own proofing basket. And what you do is you take, in here I have rice flour, and rice flour is good to be the layer between the wood and the dough because rice flour has no gluten, so it doesn't get sticky when it gets wet. So typically I just coat the inside of each of these fairly well. So you can see here.
And you coat yourself at the same time.
You can see here I put some rice flour in the bottom of each. This gives you the closest thing to a non-stick surface that you can get with wet, gooey dough. Okay. So now I'm ready to divide the dough, okay? So lots of things have happened and lots of things have been measured out, but I really don't know how much dough is left here. So what I typically do is I usually use the calculator on my phone. So I need a different calculator. Can I have your phone?
It's there.
Yeah. So I always have a calculator next to me. I got it. Okay. So the bowl and all of the dough weighs a certain amount. In my case, it weighs 4,076 grams. Okay? And now I need to weigh the bowl by itself. Out of all the times I've done this, I could have just weighed it when it was dry and empty, but this is the most exact, I guess. So now I flour out my surface. Okay. And I use this bread tool. I don't know exactly what it's called, but it's got a little bit of a fine edge. It makes it easy to cut the dough.
It's plastic.
It's plastic, correct. Okay. So now I pretty much just dump it all out, and as you can see, there's a lot of gas in there. It's very wiggly, so it dumps fairly quickly and fairly easily. Okay, and this is a very sticky process too because the dough is quite fermented. All right, so now I measure the empty bowl, which is 1383 in my case. So I subtract 1383 from the total mixture, and I divide that by 2. So each of my loaves is going to be 1346. So now I have both of the loaves right in front of me. And now I'm just going to cut this in half, and I'm going to put half of it back into the bowl. You're always going to not get the right amount unless you're lucky. And I can't remember what I said. $13.46. Oh wow, it's actually $13.46. It's also not typical to do it in the first try with cutting off the first piece. But anyways, so now I'm going to forget about that, the second loaf, and the first loaf I'm going to concentrate on here. I'm going to do a couple of things. I am going to first release the gas, okay? There's a lot of air trapped into this right now, and it's a misconception that you want to keep the air in the dough. This dough, the way I do the dough, there's going to be a lot of rise in the oven, okay? While we final proof into the refrigerator, and when we cook in the oven, it's gonna rise a lot. So we don't want these big gaps, and we don't want these big bubbles, okay? These big bubbles become massive bubbles, and they make it hard to have a sandwich, they make it hard to butter it, they make it hard to hold mustard or to hold anything. So what I do...
Or mayonnaise.
Or mayonnaise. Not mayonnaise. What I do, you just push the gas out. See this right here? You see all this right here? You see these big bubbles? We want that out. We want to pop that. So you just push it out, and you get that air out. The air during bulk proofing is not the air that we want in the final bread. Ideally, you would get all of the air bubbles out, but it's very unlikely. Okay, that looks good enough. You always want to, every once in a while, you just want to flour it. So this is very sticky at this point, okay? So you want to flour it to keep it sticking from your hand. You want to flour it to keep sticking from the table. But it's always going to stick to your hands. It's always going to stick to the table. It's not a huge deal. Okay? Okay. And now at this point, what we're looking to do here is we're looking to do 2 things. We're looking to fold the dough a little bit more, kind of like what we were doing, but with a different technique. And we want to shape the dough so that it is a little bit of a high tension boule, that the shape of the bread has a little bit of tension to the surface. Okay, so here's what that looks like. Typically what I do is my first fold, I just take it like that. And then you just turn, and you just keep folding. And then you get to the point where it's nice and folded and a little bally like this. And then what I do is I have this technique where I take my hands and I slide them under, and what that does is that starts tucking the bread, and that adds a good tension to the top of the bread. And you usually need to add some flour to that so it stops sticking to your hands. And what can happen, and usually does happen, is you get to the point where the layer of the bread there, I don't know if you can see this, there's a massive bubble here. It's full of air. It's full of air from the bulk fermenting. And what we want to do is we want to release this bubble, okay? So I typically just tear a little hole and I release it. And what's going to happen is when you keep doing that shaping motion, we're going to make that hole bigger, but that's okay. And then what we end up with is a very well shaped and a very tensioned surface for the bread. So you can see here that It's a nice flat surface, and you might even need to do that a couple times. Release some of that air. And you can just iterate over that until it's done. Now, for me, it's in a good spot. It's a nice tension shape. But see, we broke it a little bit over here, which is fine. Okay. And if it breaks too much, where it loses its shape like that, which is possible and it's common, you just refold it a couple times and then you go back to it. And these little bubbles, like when the whole surface is bubbled up, you want to release it, but I don't care about these little bubbles. These little bubbles are just normal bubbles in the bread. It's not worth ruining the tension over. So now this is in a good spot for me. So now I take my banneton with all of the rice flour at the bottom and I flip it into it, okay? Because this is the top of the bread that you want, but the top of the bread lays at the bottom of the banneton. So we just flip it in and boom. And the bottom of the bread and the top of the banneton is not usually very pretty. It usually looks a little like that. But that's the bottom of the loaf. That's gonna be at the bottom of the Dutch oven. It's not a big deal. So, then quickly, you just do the second loaf, right? Just take the rest of it. I'm gonna do this second loaf quick.